having a demographic dividend for at least the next 10 to 15 years. 50% of Indonesian population is below 29 years old, and that's why we are the #2 Facebook user in the world now, 29 million users of Facebook, and the largest, highest growth, 6th user of Twitter. I mention this because it means it's a market issue, it's the way you market in these countries. Social marketing, media or networking is another phenomena that we also need to factor in our whole story. Thank you, and I hope I haven't taken out too much of my allocated time.
Wonderful, that's great. Thank you, Mike. I have to say I'm amazed to hear your exporters actually complain. I'm amazed to hear your exporters actually complain about something. Rob, can I come to you, please?
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. I want to start off by making the point that the world economy is changing very fundamentally. In fact, an image I've been fond of using is to say that I believe that the tectonic plates of the world economy are changing. And to take the image a bit further, I think that sometimes over a prolonged period and sometimes violently and with very dramatic episodes, we are seeing new heights being created and former heights receding in significance as this happens. And of course, I think we all know what's happening, and that is that the new poles, the new heights that are being created are in parts of the developing world, led by China, but also involving India, Southeast Asia, Brazil, but also Africa and ourselves as South Africa. We're also part of that trend where I think we've seen a new dynamism and new forces of economic growth. And at the same time, I think we're seeing sluggishness in the advanced developed countries, low rates of growth, recoveries which are far from certain in those parts of the world. Indeed, I think that all the analysts are suggesting that this is likely to be a picture that persists for the next decade or so. And I think that's having quite a serious and significant consequence on patterns of global trade. And certainly, we in South Africa have noticed this. I think, for example, it's significant that in 2009, during the recession, our exports to the European Union and the United States both declined by numbers in the 30%. And our exports to China and India actually grew. And in the case of exports to China, grew by a similar proportion to the declines in the developed world. And that is really sort of something which happened in one particular year, one country, but it's part of a broader trend where we've seen that African countries' trade with other developing countries rose from $34 billion in 95 to $283 billion in 2008. And as a proportion of extra-regional trade, the increase went up from 19.6% in 95 to 32.5% in 2008. So I think that is what is beginning to happen. Now, I think that a couple of points that were made by Dr. Supachai yesterday, I think are very, very pertinent in this regard as we look ahead. The first point is, I think that in addition to overall sluggishness in performance of economies in the developed world, there's also diminishing prospects for credit funded consumer growth. I think he made that point yesterday. I think that's a very important point. At the same time, we see a country like China, as he also said yesterday, making a greater balance between domestic market growth with rises in wages and so on. And I think also very significantly, China defining a more precise import policy for the first time, which I think is an important development. So I believe that we're seeing something like a major shift, which I think is going to continue. So I expect that the growth in trade between developing countries, particularly advanced developing countries, but also other developing countries, is likely to increase. Having said that, I think a couple of points that were made both by him and also I think by Pascal Lamy are very important as well, and that is that I don't think that we can anticipate that the pace of of increases in factors which are likely to lead to increased demand for imports from other developing countries in China is likely to outpace the continued impact of depressed conditions in traditional colonial markets, if you want to call it that. And so I think the question which was posed in the previous panel is actually the most pertinent one, the question of volume versus value. And I was going to make reference to an interesting paper I came across by the Cambridge-based Chilean economist Gabriel Palma, when looking at different performances of trade by different developing countries. He was referring to the case that was talked about earlier, flying geese. The paper's called Flying Geese versus Waddling Ducks. And he starts off by taking issue with an unnamed advisor to the elder President Bush, who said that it doesn't really matter whether a country exports computer chips or potato chips. And then the whole argument is, in fact, that it does. It makes a very fundamental difference in terms of the impact on your growth prospects and things like that. So I think that really, as the prospects for volume increases probably need to be thought of in more modest terms than they were before, so I think the issue of value and composition of trade becomes much more significant. And in any case, if we want to talk about export impact for good, that is actually, as the previous panel said, where the focus needs to be put. So I think there's a couple of dimensions to that I want to conclude with. I think, first of all, for all developing countries, we need to think about the issue which was posed by Dr. Supachai for China. What is the balance between domestic market growth and export growth? I think it's not a question of export is good, domestic is bad, and all of that. We need to get into a more complex view of that. Secondly, the dimension I don't think was really mentioned is the role of regional integration in this. And certainly in Africa, this is the critical issue for African countries. We have a number of projects on the cards. I think the most exciting one in my book is we're talking about what's called a grand free trade agreement between the Southern African Development Community, the Common Market of Eastern and Southern Africa, and the East African Community. When this comes into existence, this will put in place a free trade area quite literally from Cape to Cairo on the east coast of the continent, with a population combined of 700 million people. That would make us a significant force. But what we've noticed in these things is that all the barriers to intra-regional trade, in addition to the ones that were mentioned by the professor, in developing regions, there are things to do with infrastructure, things to do with productive capacities of countries, that all of us are producing, many of us anyway, are producing the same sort of commodities for export outside the region, and we're not producing any of the things that any of us import from anywhere else. So how do we restructure our production capacities? How do we put in place the infrastructures that are going to support an increasing volume of value-added quality trade between ourselves? And then when we come to the South-South, I think that we are finding in our own trade diplomacy, we are continually putting the issue of how do we, in fact, enhance the value-added component of that trade. And we just concluded a very significant, I believe, state visit here to the People's Republic of China and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement where we agreed, as South Africa and China, we'll work together to increase the proportion of value-added products in our trade basket. That China agreed, and it said so in the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation as well. It is committed to working with African countries to invest in beneficiation of mineral products at source. I think this is the sort of challenge as we move ahead. How do we, within this new reality that's emerging of growing South-South trade, how do we change the pattern so that we actually enhance the quality of that trade, and how do we bring regional integration into the picture? So I think these are both exciting and significant times for developing countries, but also posing a new set of challenges around the value versus volume issue that was posed earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. I think maybe that regional integration argument we can come back to later during the Q&A. I'm sure that's a very important point. Harry Broadman, can I come to you, please?
Thank you very much. It's okay? It's on. Okay, great. I'd like to thank the ITC for inviting me here, and I want to say that